A vanished house guest, a locked garden gate, not a trace left behind. Welcome to the mysterious case book. I am your host, Michael. Let me know where you're listening from, and your voices bring this mystery to life. I can't wait to hear from you. Your comments truly make this journey special. Now let's begin. It was a Thursday afternoon in late spring, and the air in St. Modwen was honeyed with the scent of lilac and the earthy promise of rain. The hedgerows were beginning to bloom again, and the village, snugly nestled between the chalky hills of Westshire, was alive with the gentle stirrings of social expectation. For today, the long-anticipated garden tea at Foxglove Grange was to take place. Foxglove Grange, the ivy-clad Georgian house at the edge of the village, belonged to Colonel and Mrs. Halberton Smythe. Names whispered with either admiration or exasperation, depending on one's station and temper. The Colonel, retired from India with more medals than tact, was as fixed in his habits as his favourite sundial, while Mrs. Halberton Smythe oversaw village matters with a resolute smile and an iron grip disguised in lace gloves. It was her idea, this garden tea. A little gathering to welcome back their niece, Miss Iris Halberton, recently returned from her post in Florence, where she had been employed as a private language tutor to continental children of means. She was said to be rather independent and not particularly fond of the countryside, according to Mrs. Banbury, who had seen her arrive last week stepping out of the station cab in Italian sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat, like something from a foreign magazine. Yet the tea party had gone off splendidly, at least until the scones were brought out, and someone noticed that Miss Iris had not appeared. "She said she would only be a moment," murmured Mrs. Halberton Smythe for the 5th time, a flicker of worry playing across her otherwise firm expression. "She went to fetch her new scarf. The lemon one, you know, from Florence. She was seen going back inside some 20 minutes ago," said Reverend Winstanley, polishing his spectacles and eyeing the French fancies with evident unease. "Quite odd." "Perhaps she's taken a turn," suggested Miss Hartnell, the village's self-appointed expert on young women's nerves. "These continental postings, you know, not at all good for the constitution. I said so from the beginning." Several guests glanced toward the French doors leading into the drawing-room. They were ajar, fluttering gently in the breeze. But there was no sound from within, and no sign of Miss Iris. Mrs. Smythe, at last, excused herself with forced cheer and entered the house to investigate. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Guests began shifting in their seats. Teacups sat half-filled and forgotten. Someone remarked that the Colonel had gone inside too. Miss Marple, who had been quietly darning a snag in her glove with a borrowed thread from her reticule, looked up and blinked mildly at the growing murmurs. She had been seated in a modest wicker chair beneath the shade of a flowering hawthorn tree, mostly overlooked in the buzz of the afternoon. At last, the Colonel reappeared on the terrace, his face pale and his moustache bristling with irritation. "There seems to be some confusion," he announced. "Iris is not in the house." A silence fell upon the lawn. "Not in the house?" echoed Mrs. Banbury. "Well, where on earth is she?" "No one knows," the Colonel muttered. "Her scarf is on her bed, her suitcase is unpacked, and there's no indication she left, but she is most assuredly gone." That, as Miss Marple later remarked to herself, was when the tea truly went cold. She did not say much, only sipped at her now lukewarm Darjeeling and observed the way Mrs. Halberton Smythe clutched the back of a chair, with fingers turned nearly white. The old lady had not expected drama. Not from her niece. Not today. The village would, of course, speculate. That was its instinct, as natural as the daffodils in March or the jumble sale at Whitsun. But Miss Marple, who knew that even the nicest young women can have the most peculiar enemies, had already begun to take mental stock of the room, who looked thrilled, who seemed relieved. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she filed away one curious little fact. The lemon scarf had not been taken, and a lemon scarf, Miss Marple thought, is something a young woman takes when she means to be seen, not when she means to disappear. By the time dusk began to settle over the rooftops of St. Maudwin, the well-manicured lawns of Foxglove Grange had lost their sparkle, and the garden party had collapsed into a blur of nervous speculation and damp sponge cake. The guests, who had arrived in their Sunday best with high hopes for gossip of a light-hearted nature, now whispered in tight knots near the shrubbery, or lingered awkwardly by the terrace, unsure whether to offer help or quietly make their exit. A disappearance, especially one so unexplained, had a way of draining even the sunniest afternoon of its warmth. Miss Marple, still seated in her modest wicker chair, observed it all with a thoughtful tilt of her head. She had not moved much, but she had seen plenty. She had noted the way Reverend Winstanley paced near the tulip beds, muttering half-formed prayers under his breath. She had seen young Lydia Brent, the vicar's daughter, cast furtive glances toward the French doors every few minutes, her gloved hands twisting the hem of her cardigan, and she had certainly not missed the moment. Mrs. Smythe returned from upstairs, pale and tight-lipped, speaking in the hushed tones of someone trying very hard not to panic. The guests began to drift off around 7 o'clock, reluctant but sensing the party, if it could still be called that, was over. The colonel, always concerned with appearances, stood near the wrought iron gate, shaking hands and insisting that there was sure to be a simple explanation. Perhaps she went for a walk. Girls do that sort of thing nowadays, he offered to Mr. Penrith, the grocer's widowed brother, who responded with a doubtful nod and a glance back at the darkening house. Miss Marple was among the last to rise. She approached Mrs. Halberton Smythe with quiet sympathy, her voice soft but deliberate. "My dear, if there's anything I can do, please don't hesitate." "Oh, Jane," said the older woman, her composure cracking just slightly. "It's probably nothing. She may have gone into the village." "Oh, well, it's foolish to speculate." Miss Marple gave a small smile and touched her friend's hand. "Speculation is often quite necessary, I find. It's simply a matter of distinguishing the useful sort from the idle." With that, she left, stepping carefully down the gravel path that led back to the high street, her mind already busy sorting observations into categories: likely, unlikely, and peculiar. By the next morning, the entire village knew. It was Mrs. Blenkinsop who delivered the news to her customers at the post office with theatrical flair. Vanished, she has, without a trace, just up and gone like a character from one of those detective serials. Only this is real. Real as butter. Within hours, theories abounded. "She's eloped, that's what I say," muttered Bert Tegg, polishing a crate outside his dairy stall. "One of those foreign chaps from the continent, I'll wager. They wear trousers too tight and speak too fast." "Nonsense," scoffed Mrs. Tilling, a formidable woman with a penchant for knitted hats. "She's been kidnapped. Probably a ransom note waiting in the letterbox." No, said Mr. Broom, the village cobbler. "She's fallen in the well. You mark my words. These big houses always have old wells, and they never lock the covers properly." At the vicarage, Lydia Brent sat stiffly in the drawing-room, her teacup rattling against its saucer. Her father, Reverend Winstanley, looked up from the newspaper with an anxious frown. "Lydia," he said, "you've not been yourself since yesterday. Is there something you're not telling me?" She shook her head too quickly. "No, Father. I barely spoke to Iris. She didn't seem particularly keen on being home, that's all." "Still," the vicar said slowly, "if you know anything that might help." "I don't," she replied, and her eyes dropped to her lap. Truly. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken a quiet walk that morning around the edge of Foxglove Grange. She paused briefly outside the hedgerow gate, noting the faint impressions of footprints in the soft earth leading away from the side path. Too small for the colonel, too deep for Mrs. Halberton Smythe. She crouched, quite nimbly for her age, and examined them more closely. A woman's shoe, narrow with a short heel. The impressions were angled, perhaps, and yet the gate was bolted from within. Curious. Back in her sitting room, she placed the kettle on the hob and fetched her notebook. She did not write down everything, only what struck her as useful later. And in this case, she noted 2 items. One lemon scarf was found on the bed, but Iris's handbag was missing. No woman of sense leaves without her bag, especially one said to be rather proud of her fashion. 2. The gate near the shrubbery showed signs of someone having left, yet was bolted from the inside. If Iris had left that way, someone else must have bolted the gate afterward, or she had not left that way at all. Later that afternoon, Inspector James Craddock arrived from the county station. A man of dependable methods and ruddy cheeks, he was no stranger to St. Modwin, though he preferred to think of it as a place for retirements and whist drives, not police inquiries. He took tea with the colonel, listened to Mrs. Halberton Smythe's account, and examined the room Iris had been staying in. He did not, however, notice the faint indentation on the window-sill, nor the absence of the small gold vanity mirror Iris had been known to carry. These, of course, Miss Marple noticed, though she said nothing just yet. "I'll put out a notice," said Craddock at last. "We'll interview everyone who saw her last. Likely a misunderstanding." But Miss Marple had seen too many of life's misunderstandings, and very few involved young women vanishing without a note or a quarrel, or even a flounced departure. No, she thought. This was something else entirely. That evening, while the village speculated and the inspector formed his list of persons to question, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of cocoa and turned her attention to the parish records. Not the official ones, no. Those were too formal to be of much use. Instead, she turned to her own notes, scribbled over decades of quiet observation. She leafed back to a summer 8 years ago, when a visiting cousin of the Halberton Smiths had caused a minor stir. And again, 3 years past, when a maid at the Grange had left in haste under vague circumstances. Patterns, Miss Marple knew, had a way of repeating themselves, especially in places where appearances mattered more than the truth. And somewhere beneath the wisteria vines and Georgian decor of Foxglove Grange, she suspected a very old pattern was beginning to surface again. The following morning dawned pale and expectant, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Fog curled gently along the low stone walls and drifted across the gardens of Foxglove Grange like a silent witness reluctant to depart. Inside the Grange, the atmosphere was no less thick. Mrs. Halberton Smythe sat ramrod straight at the breakfast table, her teacup untouched, a copy of the Westshire Gazette open in front of her, though unread. The colonel stood by the French doors, arms crossed behind his back, eyes scanning the empty garden with the air of a man hoping to see something reassuringly ordinary. An errant scarf, perhaps, or a shoe carelessly left behind. But the lawn offered no answers, only dew-slick grass and bird song that felt somehow irreverently cheerful. "I do wish he'd hurry up," Mrs. Halberton Smythe said at last. "You mean the inspector?" asked the colonel. "Number Dr. Parsons. He's never late on Wednesdays. Something must have delayed him." At that moment, the butler, a narrow-chested man named Dawlish, with a manner permanently tinged by melancholy, entered with a note on a small silver tray. "Message from the surgery, madam. Dr. Parsons sends his regrets. He is attending to an emergency in Much Cramley and will call this afternoon instead." Mrs. Halberton Smythe let out a breath she had not meant to hold. "Very well. Thank you, Dawlish." The colonel grunted and moved away from the doors. Unreliable, a lot of them these days. Can't run a village in emergencies. There's always something being attended to elsewhere. Mrs. Halberton Smythe ignored this. She had more pressing matters on her mind than her husband's perpetual disdain for modern timekeeping. For one thing, the telephone had rung the night before. Just once. A single ring, and then silence. And while that in itself was not entirely unusual in a household of many years and tangled wiring, it had unsettled her. For another, she had been through Iris's bedroom again that morning and had made a discovery she had not yet shared with the Colonel. One of Iris's leather-bound sketchbooks was missing from her desk drawer, the very one she had always carried with her abroad. Iris sketched often and with great care, but she rarely let anyone see her work. Private thoughts, she called them, in pencil and charcoal. Back in the village, Inspector Craddock was making his rounds with measured persistence. He had already spoken to Lydia Brent, who had offered little of substance but much in tone. There had been something rehearsed in her replies, something tight and dry in her throat when she mentioned the garden tea. Now the inspector found himself standing at the counter of Mr. Penrith's grocery shop, eyeing the large glass jar of barley sugars as he made polite inquiries. "You were at the party, Mr. Penrith?" "I was," said the grocer, wiping his hands on a tea towel. "Left before the trouble, though. Didn't see much of the girl. Quiet one. Polite. Did she speak to anyone in particular?" "Not that I saw. Spoke to the vicar a bit. And young Lydia, briefly. But mostly she sat by herself. I watched the others." "Watched them?" Craddock frowned. "What do you mean?" Mr. Penrith thought for a moment. "Well, not in a nosy way. More like assessing, like she was seeing things others didn't. It was a little odd, if I'm honest." Craddock nodded slowly. He had the growing sense that Miss Iris Halberton had come back to Foxglove Grange with more than just holiday plans. There was a watchfulness in these descriptions that suggested unfinished business. At the same time, in a quiet corner of St. Modwen, Miss Marple sat in her sunlit sitting room, carefully going over a series of note cards laid out before her on a small, lace-covered table. Each card bore a name. Iris Halberton, Mrs. Halberton Smythe, Colonel Smythe, Lydia Brent, Dawlish. Inspector Craddock had not yet thought to interview Dawlish, but Miss Marple had always believed the domestic staff knew far more than they let on, particularly those who had learned how to appear invisible. She recalled something peculiar from the day of the tea. Dawlish had been present when the alarm was first raised, but he had not seemed surprised. Concerned, yes, but not startled. As though the possibility of Iris disappearing had already existed in his mind. That was worth remembering. By mid-afternoon, the fog had lifted, and with it, some of the unease that had settled over the village. But at the Grange, the weight remained. Dr. Parsons finally arrived just before 3 o'clock, his boots muddy and his face drawn. He offered apologies and sympathy in equal measure, but had little to contribute. "She was in good health, as far as I could tell," he said to the Colonel in the drawing-room. "Strong constitution, not the sort to faint or wander off." "Then where is she?" Mrs. Halberton Smythe snapped, losing her composure for the first time. "Where has she gone, Doctor?" He could only shake his head. "I don't know, Edith. But if it were foul play, surely there'd be some sign." That night, a soft knock came at Miss Marple's door. She rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and opened it to find Lydia Brent standing on her porch, her face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I need to speak with you about something I saw the day Iris disappeared." Miss Marple stepped aside gently. "Come in, my dear. The kettle's already on." Inside, Lydia sat by the fire and twisted her fingers together in silence before speaking. "I didn't say anything to the inspector because, well, it didn't make sense. I thought it might just be a trick of the light. But I saw someone on the veranda, just before the garden tea." "A man?" Miss Marple asked softly. "I think so. Tall in a dark coat. But it was the way he stood. Not like someone admiring the flowers. More like someone waiting, watching, and he disappeared before I could get a proper look. Did Iris see him? I don't know. But she seemed different that day. Tense, like she was expecting something. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her blue eyes unreadable in the firelight. "Thank you, Lydia. That may be more important than you know." And as the flames crackled gently in the hearth, she sat back and turned her mind to that lonely veranda and to the shadow Lydia had seen standing upon it. Someone had come to Foxglove Grange that day, uninvited and unseen, and someone, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, had not left alone. By the following day, St. Modwen's outward calm had frayed at the edges. Curtains twitched more frequently, doors were locked with unusual care, and though the sun shone obligingly, its warmth could not ease the curious tension that had settled over the village like a low cloud refusing to lift. Inspector Craddock had widened his inquiries. Notices had been distributed to neighbouring towns. A discreet alert had been issued to railway stations in the region. Iris Halberton was now listed as officially missing, though the word felt unsatisfying in the mouths of the villagers. Missing was what happened to the gloves or gardening tools. This felt heavier, more deliberate. At Foxglove Grange, the colonel had taken to stomping about the house, more agitated than he let on. He muttered often about the dashed inefficiency of modern policing, and made his distaste for Craddock's quiet thoroughness increasingly apparent. Mrs. Halberton Smythe, on the other hand, had become unusually still. She moved through the house like a figure in a painting, present, poised, but unreachable. It was on this day that Miss Marple returned to the Grange under the pretense of delivering a small jar of her own black currant jam batch. She knew Mrs. Halberton Smythe particularly admired it. "You are most kind, Jane," said the lady of the house, taking the gift with polite hands, "though I confess I don't have much of an appetite these days." "I can imagine," said Miss Marple, with gentle sympathy. Grief, well, uncertainty is a dreadful thief of appetite. They were in the morning-room, a well-ordered space filled with china ornaments and tall windows opening onto the side garden. The light streamed in delicately, catching dust motes in slow spirals. Miss Marple settled into a seat near the window and, after a pause, allowed the conversation to meander, as she often did, like a brook finding its way naturally toward a deeper current. "She was a striking girl, your niece. And clever, I imagine. Did she ever show you her drawings?" Mrs. Halberton Smythe looked up, a flicker of surprise breaking through her practiced composure. "Once or twice. Mostly landscapes. She sketched things during her travels, cathedrals, piazzas, that sort of thing. But she was terribly private about it." "Private people often have the clearest eyes," said Miss Marple. "They see what others miss." There was a silence, broken only by the ticking of a porcelain clock on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I suppose you've searched her things thoroughly?" she asked at last, with the softness of a casual inquiry. Mrs. Halberton Smythe hesitated. "I looked through her room, yes. I was hoping to find some clue to suggest she meant to go. But everything seemed in place, except she trailed off." "Yes?" prompted Miss Marple, not looking up from her cup. "One of her sketchbooks. A brown one. She always kept it locked in a drawer, but it's not there now. I assumed she had it with her, but she left her bag behind. Only her vanity mirror is missing." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is interesting. You say she kept it locked away?" "Yes. Quite determined about it, too. Said it was full of unfinished work. But I always suspected there was more to it than that." "Quite possibly," Miss Marple murmured. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, she took her leave and wandered back through the village, her steps slow and pensive. The missing sketchbook was a piece of the puzzle she had been waiting for. Sketches were more than idle doodles. In the hands of someone observant, someone like Iris, they could serve as a record, even a warning. She passed the churchyard and noted the pale figure of Lydia Brent tending the vicarage rose bushes. The girl looked up and offered a hesitant smile. I was just coming to see you, Miss Marple said. Might I borrow a few minutes of your time? Inside the vicarage, Lydia made tea, her hands less steady than before. There was a haunted air about her, something withheld. Lydia, my dear, said Miss Marple. Once they were settled, you were kind to tell me about the man you saw on the veranda, but I suspect there's more. Lydia said nothing at first. Then, with a sigh, she reached into her cardigan and drew out a folded piece of paper. I found this. I didn't mean to keep it from the police. I just didn't know what it meant. Miss Marple unfolded the paper. It was a torn sheet from a sketch pad. A pencil drawing, hurried but skillful. It showed the silhouette of a man standing near the edge of a veranda, just as Lydia had described. His face shadowed, his coat long and dark. But what struck Miss Marple most was the posture. There was a rigidity in the figure, a military stillness, and something else too. A tension in the hand, as though it clenched something. Where did you find it? She asked. Behind the hydrangea bush. I think Iris dropped it. Miss Marple examined the corner of the page. No signature, no title. But in the bottom right-hand corner, barely visible, were two small initials. A.H. She blinked. Did Iris sign her work? Not that I know of, but her father's name was Arthur. Arthur Halberton. He died when she was a child. Miss Marple tucked the sketch into her handbag. One more question, Lydia. Did Iris mention anyone she'd known in Florence? Any gentleman friend? Or someone she hoped to avoid? She once mentioned a man she taught English to. A young man, well-dressed, from a wealthy family, she said. But she never gave a name. Just called him the one who listens too well. Miss Marple sat back. A strange turn of phrase. Lydia nodded. I thought so too, but she said it like it frightened her. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a short note to Inspector Craddock, requesting a discreet inquiry through Florence's consular offices. She gave only the faintest description of the man in the sketch and asked for any records of an English woman named Iris Halberton reporting suspicious behavior during her tenure in Italy. The next morning, she posted the letter herself. As she returned home, the baker's boy passed her on his bicycle and tipped his cap. She smiled politely, then paused near the green to catch her breath. Across the street, the curtain of the Eitel grocer's flat fluttered. A shadow moved behind it, pausing just long enough to observe her. Miss Marple adjusted her scarf and continued on her way. There were more eyes in this village than anyone liked to admit, and someone, she suspected, was watching her more closely now than ever. The sun had barely risen above the thatched rooftops of St. Modwyn when Inspector Craddock stood once more on the front steps of Foxglove Grange, his hat in hand, and his expression set in a frown of slow-burning frustration. His interviews over the past 48 hours had yielded more speculation than substance. Villagers, it turned out, were fond of certainty, but only the kind they invented for themselves. No sign of forced entry. No clear motive. No note, no quarrel, no confirmed sightings, and most curiously of all, no indication that Iris Halberton had packed so much as a handkerchief. The colonel received him with the air of a man ready for battle. If you're here to ask again whether she kept a diary, he said, the answer remains no. Iris wasn't the sentimental type. Craddock stepped inside, letting the heavy oak door close behind him. I'm not here about a diary, he said. I'm here about her sketchbook. We believe she may have had it with her at the time of her disappearance. The colonel blinked. She took it out into the garden now and again, but she never went far with it. Not like a blasted journal, Inspector. What's so important about it anyway? We don't know yet, Craddock replied evenly. But it may contain drawings or names that someone didn't want seen. Mrs. Halberton Smythe, entering the hall with a tray of letters in hand, stiffened. There are no names, she said. At least, not that I recall. Just sketches. Churches, coats of arms, Even that little carving above the bakery on Church Lane. She was always observing things. I used to say she could see a quarrel brewing just by the way someone poured their tea. Craddock made a note in his small black book. Did she seem nervous in the days before the tea? The Colonel scoffed. She seemed bored, which I suppose is the modern condition. She seemed preoccupied, his wife added quietly. And she wasn't sleeping well. I heard her moving about in the night. Craddock nodded, his eyes steady. And you didn't think to mention this before? I thought she was jet-lagged, Mrs. Halberton Smythe replied, her voice taut, or perhaps just unsettled. She hadn't been home in years. Craddock closed his book. If the sketchbook turns up, he said, please notify me at once. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, scattering petals along the drive. The inspector stood for a moment on the gravel, then glanced toward the rear of the house, the veranda, the spot Lydia Brent had described. He made his way around quietly and stood on the stone flagging, peering into the undergrowth along the edges. Something had happened here. Of that he was certain. A meeting, perhaps. Or a confrontation. The surface of the stone was clean, but not so clean that it hadn't been swept. That alone struck him as odd. Meanwhile, across the village, Miss Marple was engaged in her own inquiries, conducted not with officialdom, but with courtesy, charm, and an uncanny ear for nuance. Her first stop was the vicarage, where she thanked Lydia for the sketch and offered reassurances that her discretion had been wise for now. Next, she made her way to the grocer's flat above the shop. Mr. Penrith lived alone. A tidy man with a solitary air, he had inherited the business after his brother's passing, and was known for his meticulous accounts and rather stiff manner. Miss Marple arrived under the pretense of inquiring after a new jar of cinnamon she'd heard mentioned in the women's circle. Penrith greeted her with a slight bow, and ushered her into the small parlour with reluctant hospitality. "I won't keep you long," Miss Marple said brightly. "I know how busy your mornings must be," he nodded curtly. "Everything in order, I trust?" "Oh, yes," she replied, glancing around. The room was neat, as expected, but a sketch lay on the sideboard tucked beneath a half-folded newspaper. Just the edge was visible, but enough for Miss Marple's eye to catch the curve of a pencil line of a woman's face, turned in profile. "You do enjoy your art," she said casually. Penrith blinked. "Oh, that's nothing really. Just a customer left it behind." "Would that be Miss Halberton?" she asked, with the smallest tilt of her head. He hesitated. "I couldn't say." "Odd, though," she murmured. "To leave something so carefully drawn." She reached toward her handbag, retrieving a slip of folded paper, the sketch Lydia had given her. "Perhaps you've seen this." Penrith took it with reluctant fingers and stared at it for several seconds. "No," he said finally, but his voice was strained. "Such strong lines," Miss Marple observed. "Quite a talent. It must be a comfort, drawing things exactly as one sees them, or as one wishes them to be." Penrith shifted uncomfortably and returned the paper. "Was there anything else, Miss Marple?" "Only this," she said, rising with a kind smile. "If you do remember where that sketch came from, or if you notice anything unusual, I'm quite sure Inspector Craddock would be interested. As would I, of course." He showed her out with strained politeness. The moment the door closed behind her, Miss Marple paused on the steps and glanced sideways toward the window. The curtain twitched. She walked home slowly, her mind unusually active. She now had 3 sketches, one in her possession, one known to be missing, and one glimpsed in a room where it had no business being. And then there was the matter of Mr. Penrith, a man too careful to be careless, and yet careless enough to leave a drawing in view. Or had he wanted it seen? She reached her cottage and put the kettle on, settling into her chair with her notebook. The initials A.H. nagged at her. Not just Arthur Halberton. What if they stood for something else. A location? A phrase? She flipped back through her notes from years prior, old Women's Circle minutes, gardening club rosters, and a few articles clipped from the Westshire Gazette. Then she found it. An entry from 1939. A youth art competition at the county fair. First prize, Iris Halberton. Sketch titled Afternoon at Hilbury. Signed A.H. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not Arthur Halberton at all, but a pseudonym, a way for a young girl to share something secret. A.H. was Iris. She had always signed her work that way, and now someone else had her sketchbook. Someone who understood what those initials meant and perhaps feared what the drawings might reveal. That evening, as dusk settled across St. Modwen, a figure slipped quietly into the post office. A telegram was handed across the counter. It bore no name, only a destination, Florence, and 4 words that Miss Marple would later find scribbled on the corner of an envelope tossed in the hedgerow near the Grange. Tell him. She knew. The next morning began with a stillness that felt unnatural, even for a place as contemplative as St. Modwen. Not the peaceful hush of rural routine, but the kind of silence that precedes the shattering of something fragile. In the post office, Mrs. Blenkinsop, whose tongue usually kept pace with the sorting of envelopes, was unusually quiet. She had opened the telegram ledger and stared at the most recent entry with a frown etched deeper than usual. A telegram to Florence, unnamed sender, no return address, and 4 cryptic words that meant nothing to her but carried the unmistakable scent of trouble. Tell him. She knows. By mid-morning, the village had stirred into its usual rhythm of idle movement and sharper whispers. Inspector Craddock had received a copy of the telegram via a quiet word from the regional exchange officer who had grown used to oddities from Miss Marple's postal district. The inspector, brow furrowed, made a note to follow up, but he was already occupied with an unexpected visitor. A man had arrived from London, bearing an Italian passport and a clipped Oxford accent. He had presented himself at the police station and then later at Foxglove Grange, claiming he had urgent business with Miss Iris Halberton. He wore a tailored grey overcoat despite the warmth in the air, and introduced himself with an overly gracious bow. "My name is Carlo Moretti," he said. "I'm a friend of Miss Halberton's, from her time in Florence." Colonel Smythe did not bother to hide his skepticism. "Friend, is it? Well, you're a few days late, Mr. Moretti. She's gone." "I know," the man said, lowering his voice and adjusting his silk scarf. "That is why I've come." They were seated in the drawing-room when Inspector Craddock arrived, ushered in by Dawlish, who looked more solemn than ever. The inspector took in the scene, his gaze briefly sweeping over Moretti. "Mr. Moretti," he said evenly, "I'd appreciate it if you would tell me what brings you here." "Exactly." Moretti inclined his head. "Iris and I corresponded after she left Florence. She wrote to me a week ago, very agitated. She believed someone had followed her back to England, someone she'd encountered while tutoring in Italy." "Did she say who?" asked Craddock. "Number only that he was clever, that he watched people the way artists do but without any compassion. She believed he had taken something from her, something she couldn't forgive." Craddock's expression hardened. "And you didn't think to come sooner?" "She begged me not to. She said she didn't want to draw attention to herself. But then when her last letter mentioned Foxglove Grange and how she no longer felt safe, I booked passage immediately." Craddock folded his arms. "Did you know her well?" "Well enough," Moretti said, his voice growing quiet. "We spent time together. She confided in me more than she did most. But Iris was guarded. Her trust came in fragments, like broken pieces of a mirror. Miss Marple, upon hearing of the visitor from Florence from news carried by the ever-efficient Mrs. Banbury, who had seen him at the post office, paid a call to the Grange that same afternoon. She was greeted in the parlour, where Mr. Moretti stood near the fireplace, idly examining a china figurine. "You must be Miss Marple," he said, extending a hand with continental ease. "I've heard of you. Iris mentioned you once. She said you noticed things before anyone else did." "That's very kind," Miss Marple replied as she settled into the chintz armchair, though I imagine she was merely being polite. Moretti smiled faintly. She was frightened, you know. I don't believe she ever stopped looking over her shoulder. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Forgive me, Mr. Moretti, but I always find it curious when people travel long distances without knowing precisely what they expect to find, especially when danger may await them." He met her gaze squarely. "Some people are worth the risk." There was silence for a moment. Only the ticking of the hall clock intruded. Miss Marple's eyes remained on him, soft but unrelenting. Iris was an intelligent young woman, but I suspect she was also quite brave in her own quiet way, perhaps too brave for her own good. Moretti said nothing. "I imagine," Miss Marple continued, "that if someone wanted to silence her, they would not expect her to return home to a sleepy English village with quite so much determination. Nor would they imagine a sketchbook might contain something incriminating." At that, the man stiffened but quickly composed himself. "I wouldn't know," he said carefully. "I never saw her drawings." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said, rising slowly. "But I wonder whether someone else did." That evening, Miss Marple hosted her weekly lace-mending circle. A few women attended, mostly for the tea and the chance to exchange tidbits more than threads. The conversation turned, inevitably, to the visitor from Italy. "He seems the sort who's always about to quote poetry," Mrs. Banbury sniffed, "or ask for a donation." "He looked like he ironed his shoelaces," said Miss Hartnell, which received a brief flutter of laughter. Miss Marple sipped her tea and listened. "Did anyone else notice his gloves?" she asked quietly. "Gloves?" said Lydia Brent, who had joined the group at Miss Marple's invitation. "Lovely leather," Miss Marple murmured. "But it was warm yesterday, and this morning. Too warm, surely." Lydia looked up sharply. "He wore them at the post office, too," she said. "Didn't take them off even when he signed the ledger." Miss Marple said nothing. But her mind ticked on. That night she returned to her notes. 3 sketches accounted for. 1 is still missing. The torn page from the garden bush bore faint indentations as though several pages had been pressed against it. What had been drawn before that final image? And why would Iris send a telegram if indeed it was heartening that someone knew the truth? She was not yet certain whether Iris was the sender or the target, but she had begun to suspect that the disappearance had not been an impulsive act. It had been a trap, and the bait was knowledge. Early the next morning, Dawlish the butler discovered something strange on the back veranda. A single glove, fine Italian leather, abandoned on the stone flagging. It was still warm to the touch. Dawlish had found the glove just after 6 in the morning, when the garden paths were still damp with dew and the hedgerows shimmered faintly in the rising light. He had intended only to air the breakfast room and unbolt the doors that led to the veranda, but as he stepped out, broom in hand, his foot brushed against something soft and foreign to the usual dustings of leaves and bird feathers. A single glove. Left hand. Dark brown leather, stitched with care and lined in cashmere. He had not touched it at once. Dawlish, who had served in households long enough to sense when something was wrong, simply bent and examined it where it lay just at the threshold between house and garden, as if discarded mid-stride. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he fetched a cloth from the scullery, scooped it up delicately, and placed it in a linen-lined biscuit tin, which he stored for the moment under the butler's sink. A place for things not yet spoken of. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived later that morning, summoned on unrelated business to review the correspondence Iris Halberton had received the week before her disappearance, the glove had not yet made its way into official hands. Instead, the inspector was met at the door by Mrs. Halberton Smythe herself, dressed with more care than usual and wearing the sort of expression one reserves for funerals or formal apologies. "In the library, Inspector," she said at once. "Colonel Smythe is away in town, but Mr. Moretti is with us again. He asked to speak with you directly." Craddock nodded. He found Moretti standing by the fireplace in the library, hands clasped loosely, behind his back, looking for all the world like a man rehearsing a confession or perhaps an alibi. "You've returned quickly," Craddock said without preamble. "I never left," Moretti replied. "I've taken a room above the White Hart. I couldn't bring myself to leave without answers." Craddock set his case on the desk and opened it slowly. "And have you brought any answers of your own?" "I've remembered something," Moretti said. "Not a fact, precisely, but something Iris said shortly before she left Florence." Craddock waited. She said, "If I disappear, it won't be because I wanted to vanish. It will be because someone wanted me erased." There was silence. "Did she ever mention who that someone might be?" "No," Moretti admitted. "But I believe she was being watched, not only in Italy. She believed someone from home had an interest in her, something to do with a family matter. She never said more, only that her sketches might prove inconvenient." Craddock closed his case again. "Mr. Moretti, I'd advise you to remain available. If you recall any specific names, incidents, or correspondence, I expect to be notified immediately." Moretti inclined his head, but as he turned to leave, Craddock noticed something peculiar. The man reached for his coat with his right hand, slipping it over his shoulder with ease, then hesitated as though forgetting something. "No gloves today?" Craddock asked casually. Moretti blinked, then smiled tightly. "Misplaced. I'm always doing that." Craddock said nothing more, but his mind began drawing lines between the veranda, the telegram, and the warmth of a glove too recently discarded. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received a quiet tap at her door. It was Dawlish, looking uncomfortable in his overcoat and hat, which he had worn despite the warm weather. "I wouldn't usually, Miss Marple," he began, "but I thought perhaps you might know what to do with it." He produced the biscuit tin, removed the lid, and gently lifted out the glove with his handkerchief. Miss Marple studied it. "Found this morning," he said. "Veranda steps. I thought it odd, seeing as no one came in or out that I know of, and the Colonel was away." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "And Mrs. Halberton Smythe?" "In the conservatory," he replied. "Most of the morning, arranging dahlias." Miss Marple held the glove closer to the window. "Do you recognize it?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Not from any of the household." "Then it belonged to someone visiting," she murmured, "or someone who shouldn't have been seen." That evening, the library at Foxglove Grange sat in moody half-shadow, its lamps lit low, and its corners heavy with the smell of old paper and rosewood polish. Mrs. Smythe had taken to reading there in the evenings, or at least pretending to, her gaze rarely fixed on the page before her. It was here, just after 9, that Lydia Brent delivered a parcel of sewing patterns her father had borrowed and saw something strange through the low window. A figure, not moving, just standing, watching. She did not see the face, only the outlined man's frame, pressed just slightly to the glass, head tilted as though listening. Then, as she approached the path, the figure was gone. She rang the bell with trembling hands. Dawlish opened it, his expression shifting to concern when he saw her face. "Someone was outside the library," she whispered. "I didn't want to call the inspector without asking first." Dawlish fetched a torch. Together they checked the windows, all locked. But the print of a small, narrow shoe with a triangular heel was embedded in the flower bed beneath the pane, and wedged just beside it, caught in the root of a rose bush, was a scrap of paper folded 3 times. Dawlish unfolded it under the light. It was a sketch, A man's face, half turned in profile, eyes narrowed, mouth tight. The lines were hurried but expressive. It was unmistakably Carlo Moretti, and beneath the image, a single line was written in neat, familiar script. "He knows I remember." Miss Marple received the sketch the following morning, tucked quietly into the side pocket of her postbox, wrapped in brown paper with no note. She examined it under her reading lamp, then compared it to the torn sketch Lydia had first provided. Same paper, same shading, same artist's hand. And the message is more than a warning, a confession. She tucked it into her handbag, made herself a pot of tea and sat down with her notebook once more. The gloves, the sketches, the whispers in Florence. The telegram was sent in the dark. It was not a question of who had harmed Iris. It was now a question of when she had known the truth, and what had happened the moment she tried to make it known. It was a rare overcast morning in St. Maudwin, and the clouds hung low above the sloping fields like great woolen blankets refusing to lift. The usual cheer of the village children's laughter outside the schoolhouse, and the polite chatter of neighbors passing on cobbled lanes felt muted beneath the weight of something unspoken. A chill had settled over the Grange, and with it came a sense that answers were very close, or perhaps dangerously close. Miss Marple awoke with a distinct sense of urgency. She had spent the previous evening reviewing the sketches. Now each was marked with the faint signature A.H., each seemingly innocuous, but to her experienced eye, brimming with quiet intent. The latest, delivered anonymously, showed Moretti with a stare that unsettled even on paper. There was tension in the jawline and a carefully drawn scowl in the eyebrows, and behind the figure was drawn ever so faintly something that appeared to be the corner of a room, with a panelled wall and what might have been ivy. Not the creeping sort found on a garden wall, but stylized Gothic in form. Ivy carved into stone. It was an architectural detail, and for Miss Marple, who knew that truth often lived in overlooked flourishes, it was enough to merit closer attention. She finished her tea, selected a more weather-resistant hat, and made her way down the lane toward the old church on the hill. St. Maudwin's church had stood for centuries, its flint walls and crooked bell tower weathering wars, winds, and the stubborn indifference of time. But more importantly, it had history, more than sermons and weddings. The church had once belonged to a nearby manor, long since dismantled, though fragments of it remained embedded in the village. And there, in the stone above the archway of the side chapel, was what she had hoped to find. A carving of twisted ivy, framing an arch with near-exact precision to what had been shown in the background of the sketch. Miss Marple stared at it for a long moment. Then she turned to the vicarage and knocked gently at the door. Lydia Brent answered, pale as ever, but steadier now, as though the act of confiding had granted her a measure of resolve. "I was just about to walk to the green," Lydia said, "but please do come in." Miss Marple stepped inside, removing her gloves with care. "My dear," she began, "you've been a great help already. But I have one more question. That sketch you found is the one in the garden. Was it the only one?" Lydia hesitated. "Number I saw another, but I didn't keep it." "Where was it?" "In the vestry. I was tidying the hymnals the day before the tea. I found it tucked into the back of the ledger cupboard. I thought it had been mislaid by a choir member, someone sketching during long sermons. But now she retrieved a small journal from the sideboard, flipped to a page, and showed Miss Marple a rough recreation she had copied out of instinct. A woman was seated on a bench, head bowed as if in prayer, but her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Behind her, again, the carved ivy arch, the same framing. But this time, a figure stood in shadow behind her, barely distinguishable, except for the unmistakable line of a glove in one hand. Miss Marple's breath caught. The composition was almost theatrical in its stillness. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That confirms a great deal." Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock received word from Florence. The consular report had arrived, and while most of it concerned unremarkable clerical notes, residency dates, teaching contracts, and employment references, there was a small, handwritten addendum tucked at the end. Miss Halberton expressed concern in February about a student who had followed her outside of formal lessons. No official complaint filed. She mentioned she was returning to England sooner than planned. The student's name? Carlo Moretti. Craddock placed the document on the table and exhaled sharply. It was all unraveling now, though not as neatly as he liked. Miss Marple's private messages had proven invaluable. Never accusatory, only suggestive, but each thread tugged seemed to reveal more than expected. That same evening, as dusk painted the hedges in lavender hues, a gardener employed part-time by the Grange made a quiet discovery behind the rear tool shed in an area few visited now, overgrown and shadowed beneath the pines. A shallow depression in the earth. Not deep, not fresh, but disturbed, and wedged just beneath a tangle of ivy, the broken clasp of what appeared to be a leather-bound book. A sketchbook. The gardener brought it at once to Dawlish, who, suppressing his instinct to delay, carried it directly to Miss Marple. She examined the cover, worn, the corners frayed, but unmistakably Italian in make, and inside pages were torn and sketches were missing, but enough remained to confirm the truth. Among the intact pages was a portrait of a woman sitting on the Grange veranda, another of the colonel polishing a brass watch. And then just 3 pages before the back is a detailed rendering of Moretti. Face flushed, mouth open, caught mid-speech. He had not known he was being drawn. That much was clear. The angle was too precise, too observational, not posed, but recorded, and beneath the sketch, in faint pencil, the one who listens too well, the one who waits. Miss Marple closed the book and set it gently on the table. The truth was almost complete now, but there was still something missing, something buried not beneath ivy or sketchbooks, but within the stories people told themselves to keep the world in order. She walked to the Grange the next morning, passing the white-flowered hedges, the garden gate, and finally the French doors of the veranda, now closed and fastened with new locks. She was let in by Dawlish, who said nothing and only nodded. Mrs. Halberton Smythe met her in the morning room. "I imagine you've come about the glove," she said flatly. "No," said Miss Marple. "I've come about the memory." The older woman blinked. "I don't follow." Miss Marple folded her hands. "You knew who the man in the sketch was, didn't you? Long before he showed up in your parlor." Mrs. Halberton Smythe remained very still. Iris returned home because she had discovered something in Florence, perhaps. But it wasn't only about Moretti. She was trying to reconnect with something here. Something she had sensed long ago. You may not have realized it, but children are very perceptive. Iris was many things, Mrs. Halberton Smythe said, her voice dry. But she wasn't sentimental. "No," agreed Miss Marple. But she was truthful. And she never forgot the time she saw a man arguing in the garden, a man you told her never to speak of again. There was silence, only the clock ticked in protest. "And now," Miss Marple said softly, "I believe someone else wanted her silence. Someone who believed she might reveal what she saw, not in words, but in drawings." She withdrew the sketchbook and placed it gently on the table. Mrs. Halberton Smythe reached for it with trembling hands. "She said she was going to show the inspector," she whispered. "But I didn't think she meant it." "She meant it," Miss Marple said, "and someone else knew that." Outside, the bell tower chimed the hour. And, in the village square, Inspector Craddock stepped out of the post office with the final confirmation in hand. Carlo Moretti's real surname, buried in old immigration papers, wasn't Moretti et al. It was Halberton, a cousin, estranged, forgotten, and now very likely capable of murder. Inspector Craddock stood at the edge of the churchyard, holding a slim sheaf of papers that rustled in the soft breeze. The sun had finally broken through the lingering overcast, casting long gold shafts across the mossy headstones and tilting shadows along the stone wall. It should have been a peaceful scene, and yet, in his hands, the truth weighed heavier than the air. Carlo Moretti, born Carlo Edwin Halberton. A fact so well concealed, it had taken Craddock nearly a week of international correspondence, embassy requests, and consular footnotes to piece together. The connection was distant but real. Moretti's mother had been the sister of the late Arthur Halberton, Colonel Smythe's first wife's brother. There had been an argument decades ago, something to do with money, perhaps disgrace. The name was abandoned, the line quietly severed. Or so the family believed. But bloodlines, as Craddock well knew, had a habit of creeping back like ivy. Unwelcome. Persistent. He folded the papers and turned back toward the lane, walking at a brisk pace until the hedges thinned and the turrets of Foxglove Grange came into view once more. The time had come for confrontation, but even as he rehearsed his approach, he couldn't shake a lingering unease. Moretti had vanished. That morning, the landlord at the White Hart Inn had reported that the gentleman from Florence had failed to return to his room the night before. His suitcase remained unpacked, his passport untouched in the desk drawer. Only his gloves were missing. And now, with the evidence of his identity secured, Craddock was beginning to worry they were no longer dealing with a man hiding secrets. They might be dealing with someone prepared to destroy anyone who remembered them. Back at Miss Marple's cottage, the atmosphere was curiously calm. The old clock on her writing bureau ticked steadily. A tray of half-eaten digestive biscuits sat beside her knitting basket, and the sound of sparrows outside the window provided a counterpoint to the quiet thrum of deduction in her mind. She had reviewed the sketches again that morning, particularly the ones from the recovered sketchbook, now resting in a sealed evidence bag beside her umbrella stand. One drawing in particular continued to haunt her. A young iris standing just outside the ivy-carved chapel arch. Her face was upturned, curious and almost frightened. And behind her, half shrouded in shading, was a boy. Slight of build, narrow-faced, leaning against the wall with one arm bent, observing. She flipped to another page and found the same boy, this time seated at a table, a chessboard before him. His opponent was only half-rendered. That was the brilliance of Iris's sketches. She captured not just faces, but intentions. And now Miss Marple believed that somewhere among them was the moment Iris had truly understood who Carlo Moretti was. Not the charming foreign gentleman from Florence, but the discarded shadow of a family secret left too long in darkness. It was late afternoon when Lydia Brent arrived, breathless and pale. "I think I've seen him," she whispered. "Seen whom?" Miss Marple asked, already knowing the answer. "Moretti. I was walking by the mill lane. Near the old gardener's path is the one that leads down behind the Grange. I thought I saw someone just standing." He turned when he saw me. I recognized his coat. Miss Marple reached for her shawl. "We must be careful," she said, "but I believe you may have seen something very important indeed." Half an hour later, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock stood together beneath the arch of the overgrown gardener's trail. The path was narrow, dappled with sunlight, and rarely used since the lower orchard had been sold off to a developer some years prior. Craddock knelt, examined the soft moss underfoot, and nodded toward a fresh heel mark. "He's been through here, within the last few hours." They moved slowly, following the path as it curved behind the Grange's stone boundary wall. Ivy clung to every surface. The trees thickened, birds scattered, and then, just past the last bend before the stream, they saw him. Moretti stood with his back to them, facing the water. He did not turn at the sound of their approach. His shoulders were slumped. One gloved hand hung at his side. Craddock stepped forward first. "Carlo Halberton," he said. You need to come with us." For a moment there was silence. Then Moretti spoke without turning. "You've found the sketchbook." "We have," Craddock replied, "and we know who you are." At that, Moretti laughed softly, a bitter, hollow sound. "They never remembered me. Not once. Not at Christmas. Not when my mother died. Not when I wrote Iris under my real name as a child. They ignored me." "You never had the right to harm her," Craddock said firmly. Moretti finally turned. His face was tired, lined with something older than age. "I didn't," he said. Miss Marple stepped closer. "Then where is she?" Moretti looked at her, and for the first time the flicker of charm he so often wore vanished entirely. "She left the night before the tea." "That's not possible," Craddock said. "Her scarf was still on the bed. Her mirror is gone. Her shoes are missing. She left without money." "She had a plan," Moretti said. "She was going to expose me, publicly. She said she would send the sketchbook to the authorities, to the papers. She said her mother knew who I was, that the colonel had lied for years." "Did you threaten her?" Craddock asked. "No," Moretti whispered. "She was braver than me. I begged her to stay quiet. I told her I'd go back to Florence, but she didn't believe me." "Then what happened?" Miss Marple asked, her voice impossibly gentle. Moretti's hands clenched. "She met someone, that night, in the chapel garden." Craddock narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I followed her, just once. She wasn't alone. There was someone else waiting." "Who?" Miss Marple asked. "I couldn't see, but it wasn't me who silenced her." Silence fell between them. Craddock stepped forward and produced the warrant he had tucked in his coat pocket. "You'll come with us, Mr. Halberton." As he placed a hand on Moretti's shoulder, the man did not resist. Only said one last thing. "She was the only one who saw me clearly. That's why she was dangerous. Not because she hated me, because she understood." Later that evening, as twilight gathered over the Grange, Miss Marple sat again by her fireplace. The sketches were with the inspector now, and the evening paper carried only a hint of what had unfolded: a detained foreign visitor, police activity near the orchard. But the truth, Miss Marple knew, had not yet surfaced fully. Moretti may have followed Iris, but someone else had been waiting that night, someone who had a deeper stake in what Iris remembered, someone who had something more to lose than family shame. And until that figure stepped into the light, the mystery of what truly happened beneath the ivy would remain just beyond reach. She looked at the last page of her notes and underlined a single name, a name she had not considered closely before. Not Moretti, not the colonel, not even Dawlish. She tapped her pen against the margin, and then she circled it. Because sometimes the truth doesn't hide in the shadows. It stood politely, with folded hands, behind the very doors no one dared open. The next morning, the village of St. Modwen awoke to the quiet tension that follows a partial storm, the kind of unease that lingers when the wind has paused, but the clouds remain. Though Carlo Moretti had been taken into custody, no official charges had been announced, and the questions that hung in the air were of a more unsettling kind. Where was Iris Halberton? And if Moretti had not silenced her, then who had? The village murmured over scones and at sewing circles, piecing together what they knew, which was little, and filling the rest with speculation. The colonel, returned from his trip to town and briefed by Inspector Craddock, had taken to sulking in the conservatory, eyes narrowed behind the Daily Telegraph, as if daring the paper to print his name. Mrs. Smythe carried herself with brittle dignity, but those who had known her longest noted a change in her step. It was not grief exactly, nor anxiety. It was the look of someone rearranging her thoughts to align with a reality she had hoped would never rise to the surface. But at Miss Marple's cottage, The kettle whistled gently on the hob, and the mind behind the lace-curtained windows remained as focused as ever. She had reviewed her notes again that morning, the sketches, the interviews, the subtle omissions, and had come to the conclusion she had long suspected. Moretti had not lied about everything. He had indeed followed Iris. He had indeed tried to dissuade her from revealing the truth. But something in his manner, in the rawness of his reaction when confronted with the recovered drawings, told her that he had not been the one to silence Iris. Nohis was a face haunted by regret, but someone else in the village bore a different burden entirely. At mid-morning, Miss Marple requested a visit from Inspector Craddock. He arrived just after 11, coat draped over his arm, expression grave. "She's not dead," Miss Marple said quietly before he could speak. Craddock blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Iris," she said, folding her hands neatly on her lap. "She's not dead. At least, I believe she's not." She ran. Craddock sat slowly, watching her. "She had every intention of exposing her cousin," Miss Marple continued, "but someone else in the household intercepted her plans. I believe they frightened her. Perhaps he confronted her late that night. She fled rather than risk a direct confrontation. You're suggesting a conspiracy?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Just a private horror, one that has remained buried beneath politeness and hydrangeas for years." She reached into her desk drawer and retrieved the name she had circled the night before. "Have you ever considered Dawlish?" Craddock's eyes narrowed. "The butler. He's served the Grange for nearly 3 decades, lives in the attic rooms, sees everything, says little. It's a perfect position from which to observe and to hide. But why? What motive could he possibly have?" Miss Marple passed over a page from an old parish newsletter, yellowed at the edges. It listed the names of beneficiaries to the late Arthur Halberton's estate, divided discreetly and, at the time, considered modest. Among them, one name stood out, Reginald Dawlish, not listed as staff, not listed at all under occupation. Craddock's brow furrowed. I hadn't seen this. "It was a small inheritance," Miss Marple said. "A few £100, but enough to raise a question. Why would a Halberton heir include a young man then barely 18 and already in service among his listed bequests?" Craddock looked up. "An illegitimate son?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said. "Or something more complicated. But it links them, and if Iris had uncovered it, and I believe she did, it may have placed Dawlish in a most compromising position, especially if she was about to make the connection public." Craddock rose. "I'll have him brought in." "No," Miss Marple said quickly. "You'll frighten him. He's not a violent man, Inspector, but he is proud, and secrets like his fester in silence. I suggest something gentler. Invite him to tea." "Here." Craddock hesitated. Miss Marple smiled. "You'll be in the kitchen, of course?" Just out of sight. An hour later, Dawlish arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. He came without hesitation, carrying his usual air of sorrowful formality. But his eyes flicked twice to the curtains as he entered, and his gloved hands lingered too long on the back of the chair she gestured toward. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Dawlish," she said warmly, pouring out tea. "It's not every day one can thank a man for keeping a household together under such strain." He nodded politely. "You're too kind, Miss Marple. I wondered," she continued, "whether you might remember a certain year. 1929. There was a spring fete at the rectory, and young Arthur Halberton donated a sum to the parish. Do you recall?" Dawlish stiffened slightly. "I was quite young then," he said, "but I remember." "And Iris?" she said softly. "She once drew a sketch of the chapel arch. She said she had seen someone standing there, watching her father argue with a young man who wore the house livery but kept to the shadows." Dawlish's fingers twitched. "Iris had an eye for detail," Miss Marple went on. And I imagine when she returned from Florence and began digging into old family papers, she may have found something of an old will, perhaps, or a ledger, enough to tie the name Dawlish to the Halberton line. "I don't know what she found," he said, the words clipped. "She never told me." "But she confronted you," Miss Marple said gently. He said nothing. "She meant no harm," she added, "but she wanted the truth. She believed truth mattered." Dawlish's voice, when it came, was low. "She said I had no claim, that blood didn't give rights, that the Grange wasn't mine to dream about." "You never harmed her," Miss Marple said. "But you frightened her. You told her to leave." "And she did." Dawlish looked up, his face a mixture of shame and something close to relief. "I saw her slip out through the east gate, just before dawn. I never thought she'd go far. I only wanted her to stop, to let it rest." "Where did she go?" "I don't know," he whispered. But she took the long coat from the hall, and the travel satchel. She knew the buses were running for the fair that morning. She could have gone anywhere. Miss Marple poured him another cup of tea. "She'll be found," she said quietly. "And when she is, I suspect she'll understand what you meant, even if she disagreed." Dawlish nodded slowly, his shoulders sinking. In that moment, he looked far older than his years, like a figure from another time who had clung too tightly to a story no longer his. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock wired stations in the surrounding counties, focusing on small towns hosting seasonal fairs during the week of Iris's disappearance. And at a sleepy boarding house just outside Bridstow, a young woman checked her reflection in a cracked mirror, removed a long borrowed coat, and folded it neatly into a trunk. In her lap rested a sketch pad. She turned to a blank page and began to draw. The following day, a thin drizzle settled over Saint Modwin, softening the edges of the thatched rooftops and lending a melancholy sheen to the slate pavements. The postman moved more slowly than usual, his canvas bag damp at the corners. In the parlor windows, villagers peered out at the mist with the kind of watchful expectation typically reserved for local elections or incoming thunder. But inside Miss Marple's cottage, the atmosphere was quite different. The old detective had spent the better part of the morning writing 3 carefully worded letters. Each was addressed to a different recipient, one to Inspector Craddock, another to Iris Halberton, care of a forwarding address recently obtained by the Bridstow constable, and the third to a certain solicitor in Exeter who had, many years ago, handled the estate of the late Arthur Halberton. All 3 letters carried the same closing line: "There is healing in truth, even when it hurts." She sealed them, affixed the stamps with careful pressure, and placed them on the silver tray near the door. The kettle, as always, whistled obligingly in the background. It had been 2 days since Dawlish had admitted to warning Iris away. He had not confessed to any crime, only to a history long denied and a confrontation that had pushed a frightened young woman to vanish rather than fight. Miss Marple believed him, but the puzzle was not yet complete. There remained one lingering absence in the picture of events she had built so delicately over days. Not just what had happened, but what had failed to happen. Why had Iris not written? Not to the inspector, not to her aunt, not even to Miss Marple herself, though she had once mentioned over tea cakes in the garden that she found Miss Marple rather like an unassuming painting that keeps staring back at you. Had she lost her nerve, or had someone intercepted her? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Dawlish stood on the threshold again, hat in hand, his shoes gleaming despite the weather. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple," he said, "but there's something else." "Please come in," she replied, motioning to the armchair. He sat carefully, as if mindful not to disturb the patterns of a room more observant than he was used to. "I've remembered something," he said, "from the morning after she vanished." Miss Marple waited. "The east gate is where I saw her leave. The latch was bent. Just slightly. I'd noticed it earlier in the week and meant to report it, but after she disappeared, I went back, and it had been straightened. You're sure? Yes. I used to do the repairs myself. The bolt had been forced some time before rusting clean through on one side, but when I checked the morning after, it had been replaced. Fresh weld, smooth polish. Miss Marple tilted her head. And no one told you it had been done? No one, he said. And that gate is rarely used. Only 2 people ever kept a key. Myself and the Colonel. A silence followed. Miss Marple rose, walked to her desk, and withdrew a small piece of folded sketch paper from beneath a stack of clippings. She passed it to Dawlish. It was a drawing not of a person this time, but of a scene of the Grange veranda viewed from behind a garden hedge. A figure was visible through the window, seated, large frame, military stance, head bowed over a letter. The shading of the figure was darker than the rest, as if the artist had pressed harder, as though imprinting her suspicion directly into the lines. Iris drew that the day before she vanished, Miss Marple said. She watched him read something, a letter, perhaps, or a document, and I believe she realized then that she'd been wrong all along. Wrong? She had assumed Moretti was the threat, but that sketch tells me she began to suspect the Colonel. Dawlish frowned. You think he intercepted her plans? Miss Marple said. Perhaps he learned she was preparing to speak to the police. Perhaps he saw one of the sketches. But the Colonel is a man of pride, Mr. Dawlish, and pride, when injured, can be more dangerous than any weapon. Outside, the mist thinned as the afternoon wore on, and the sun began to pierce the clouds in angled slants. By evening, the inspector had returned from Bridstow. She's safe, he said, standing in Miss Marple's parlour, hat dripping by the door. Iris. She checked into the boarding house under the name Florence Winters. She told the landlady she was recovering from a complicated family matter. She agreed to return. Quietly, for now. Miss Marple nodded. Did she say why she waited? She was afraid. She said she'd caught the Colonel reading through her sketchbook. He said he made a remark that chilled her. Artists always draw too much truth, he told her. She packed that night and left. Didn't want to risk staying. Thought he might destroy the sketches. He tried, Miss Marple said softly. But he didn't find them all. That evening, as Craddock returned to Foxglove Grange to conduct one final conversation with Colonel Smythe, Miss Marple took a slow walk down the green. She paused beneath the wisteria arch that once marked the entrance to the garden tea, the same one where Iris had vanished quietly, without fanfare. So much had been about appearances, she thought. The garden parties, the silver trays, the stiff greetings. But the truth had bloomed beneath it all. It always did. Back at the Grange, Craddock found the Colonel in his study, polishing a decanter. I understand Iris is returning, the Colonel said without looking up. She is. The Colonel nodded once. She's not to be blamed. Bright girl, just misdirected. Misdirected, Craddock repeated. Or perceptive. The Colonel finally turned, and something behind his eyes flickered. She'll be welcomed, he said. Of course. Craddock nodded. But in his tone, there was no agreement, only procedure. Later, he would file a private report, noting that while there was insufficient evidence to press charges, there remained an undercurrent of intimidation, one not easily proven but clearly felt. As Miss Marple knew, not all crimes were loud. Some unfolded in quiet corridors. Some were carved in old inheritance lines and left to fester in silence. And some, like Iris's disappearance, were not crimes at all, but warnings left in pencil, visible only to those who had learned how to read the margins. The next day, Iris returned. She walked up the drive alone, sketchbook clutched to her side. The house greeted her in silence. Dawlish opened the door and nodded once, not as a servant, but as something more ancient, perhaps a witness. Miss Marple stood at the end of the lane and watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. Some stories didn't end with triumph. Some ended with understanding. And that, she thought, was sometimes the greater justice. The days that followed Iris Halberton's return to Foxglove Grange passed slowly, like the settling of fine dust after a long overdue house cleaning. No one spoke loudly. Conversations were hushed, tea was poured with care, and footsteps across the parquet floors echoed with greater clarity, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Iris moved through the Grange with a gentle quietness, not as one ashamed nor one defeated, but as a person newly aware of the walls around her. She spent her mornings in the conservatory, sketchbook in hand, the broad panes letting in soft September light. Her lines were slower now, more deliberate. Each stroke of the pencil was a decision. The Colonel, for his part, did not interfere. He kept mostly to his study, emerging only for meals and brief conversations that bore the sheen of civility and little else. He spoke to Iris as one might to a guest who had long overstayed their welcome, but never with cruelty. There was something else behind his eyes now, an awareness that the last remnant of control he once held had slipped through his fingers, not with noise, but with observation, the kind that only someone like Iris or Miss Marple was capable of making. Mrs. Smythe resumed her schedule of luncheons and social calls with admirable, if somewhat forced, enthusiasm. She mentioned nothing of the sketches, not of the old inheritance, not of the silence she had helped foster. But her posture had changed. There was less rigidity in the spine and more pause before she spoke, as if she too was learning to listen. In the village, speculation died down more slowly. The disappearance of Iris had been delicious gossip, as had her reappearance and confusion. Why had she vanished at all? Some whispered. Was there truly a threat, or was it all nerves? Miss Marple, however, did not engage in such conjecture. She had seen the truth of the matter not only in words and clues, but also in shadows, glances and pauses. Human nature, after all, rarely lies. It merely rearranges its truths behind layers of pride, shame, or fear. One afternoon, as the leaves began to bronze along the village green, Iris appeared at Miss Marple's door. She carried no sketchbook this time, only a small parcel wrapped in lavender paper and tied with thin white twine. "I thought you might like this," she said. "I found it, between the pages of an old botanical reference book in the library. I must have hidden it there before I left." Miss Marple took the parcel with a nod, her fingers careful as she untied the twine. Inside was a folded sheet of heavy paper, a drawing unfinished, but unmistakably hers. It was a tea party. The garden is in full bloom. Ladies in hats and gloves, trays of pastries, and, nearly invisible unless one looked closely, a single figure at the edge of the hedge, watching, drawn faintly, head down, coat collar up. A presence Iris had seen before any of them. "I kept drawing the same thing," Iris said softly. "I thought I was trying to make sense of Moretti, but it wasn't him, not really. It was always the feeling that someone was listening behind the door." Miss Marple set the drawing down gently. "You've always seen clearly, my dear, even when others preferred the fog." Iris gave a faint smile, then looked away. "I suppose I should go back, eventually, to Florence, or perhaps somewhere else. But I wanted to say thank you." "No need for that," Miss Marple said. "What matters is that you came back, that you didn't let silence win." Iris hesitated. "He was my cousin, Moretti, and Dawlish, I never guessed. There were so many versions of the truth hiding in that house." "As there are in most houses," Miss Marple said gently. "But you saw them, you brought them out. That takes a particular kind of courage." That evening, as dusk settled over St. Modwen, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the drawing propped against a small bookstand on the mantel. The village had returned, for all appearances, to normal. Mrs. Banbury had resumed her knitting circle. Reverend Winstanley was drafting his harvest sermon. Even Lydia Brent had begun tutoring school children in the afternoons again, though she walked more briskly past the Grange than she once had. Only Miss Marple noticed the small changes in the way Dawlish stood a little straighter when greeting Iris. The way Mrs. Smythe lingered over garden plans she used to delegate without thought, and the way Iris, when sketching now, sometimes smiled faintly at what she saw before committing it to paper. It was in those changes, Miss Marple believed, that true justice had been done. Not in arrests or headlines or official conclusions, but in the quiet shift of a house no longer haunted by its unspoken past. A week later, Inspector Craddock paid a final visit before filing away the case as closed under civil discretion. He found Miss Marple in her garden, pruning the asters with her usual precision. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "Again." "No need," she replied with a smile. "I did very little." Craddock chuckled. "You always say that, and yet you always seem to see things before the rest of us." She handed him a small bundle of clipped stems. "Sometimes it's simply a matter of paying attention to what isn't being said." He nodded, then added more seriously, "Do you think she'll stay?" "Iris?" "For a while," Miss Marple said. "Long, enough to draw what she needs to remember, and perhaps long enough to forget what doesn't." Craddock looked out across the village green. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "every time I think I've seen the whole picture, you show me there's still a corner I've missed." Miss Marple gave a modest shrug. "People are like drawings, Inspector. If you only glance at the outline, you miss the depth, weight of shadow, the suggestion of movement." He smiled. "Quite right." He tipped his hat, and as he walked away, Miss Marple returned to her pruning. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting the last golden rays across the rooftops of St. Modwyn. A few birds called out, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then fell silent. And in the soft light of evening, the quiet village, no longer as innocent, no longer quite the same, seemed to exhale. Miss Marple folded her seat, gathered her gloves, and stepped back into her cottage. Tomorrow would come with more flowers to trim, more tea to pour, and perhaps another story waiting just beneath the surface. But for now, all was still, and the truth at last was safely in the open.